Hey, it's Jag, and today I'm retweaking the overdrive in the Triwatt. Those of you who watched my features demo, if you watched the longer one, you'll recall that I did not use the overdrive on the Triwatt. I had done all the tweaking to the overdrive circuit, but I had done that without really paying attention to how it would relate back when I turned it off to the clean sound. That capacitor I put across the plate load resistor really darkened the tone of the amp quite a bit. When I would turn the overdrive off, everything would sound very thin and brittle. I really did go too far with that. So about a week ago, I set the overdrive circuit back to stock. I figured probably the best idea was to play with it for a while the way it is stock and then start tweaking, which makes a lot more sense. So sometimes we don't really think our choices through too well, and I didn't on that one. I have dialed the overdrive in its stock form to what I think is the best sound. Here's the front panel of the Triwatt, and you can see I've got the normal and the bright volumes. They're up at about 1:30, 2 o'clock. I've got the overdrive over here at about 10:30. Bass is at about 10. I've got the treble almost 3 o'clock, 2:30-ish. Middle is at about 9:30. Presence is full up, and the master is full up. So those are the settings I've dialed in on the Triwatt. So now I'm ready to do some modding, and then I'm going to play around with it a bit and see how I like it. Before I make any changes on the Triwatt, I'm going to hook it up to the oscilloscope, and then we'll look at the gain after the normal and bright channels just before they go into the overdrive circuit, and then I'll check what it's looking like on the other side with the settings I like. It's a pretty good idea to get an idea of how the voltage, how much gain you are getting through the tube, and as well we'll look at how the DC component changes on the plate. So before I do anything else, I thought it'd be a good idea to show you how the Triwatt sounds the way I've got it set right now. Here's the sound without the overdrive. Here's with the overdrive turned on. So that's the sound of the Triwatt, both with and without the overdrive. So with the overdrive turned off, it's still a crunchy tone. That's generally the way I set my amps up. If I want it clean, I set it so I can roll off the volume maybe to around somewhere between 4 and 6. I got the volume at about 4 there. Again, take it all the way up and the overdrive turned off. I can roll that back even just a little bit to about 7 or 8 and play light. And it'll still be clean. If I punch it, you'll hear the crunch. So I just thought I'd let you hear those sounds before I start messing with it. So now that we've got the baseline tone established, it's time to look at the state the amp is in right now before we change anything. I'll be putting a 1 kilohertz sine wave at about 85 millivolts into the front of the amp. I'm just using this old Fostex TT15 signal generator. Here's the overdrive circuit V2B, and here's those mixing resistors. From there it goes either into V2 A here, or if it's switched for the overdrive in, it goes through V2B first, then goes all through here, and then goes into the grid of V2A. I have the A probe for my USB oscilloscope, taking essentially the signal from the hot of the link input, so directly in, no stages of gain or anything, where we're going to check the gain with and without overdrive using this probe to pin 2 of V2B. I've essentially connected it right on this pin. We will be able to monitor what our signal level is going in, when we've bypassed the overdrive and then when we engage the overdrive, so we don't have to change any probes. I'd like to reduce the gain, and that's mainly so that when I have the gain volume turned all the way up, it maybe has a little more gain than I would want, but not as much as this has right now. It gets pretty mushy and woolly up there. I find that the bottom end doesn't hold together as much as I like. When I have the overdrive out and I have my tone dialed, that's the basic, that's the starting point. That's where I want everything to have the kind of tone I want. On that crunch without the overdrive, the bottom end is nice and tight. The high end is crisp. Everything is round. Nothing is harsh sounding. When I roll the volume back on the guitar, I get a really sweet, clean tone. And that's where I really like to have a certain amount of bottom end. I really like a girthy, round bottom end, and even on the grindier sort of classic rock tones, or like in Yes, in the medley, I said I really like that bitey neck sound. That's where that all comes from. I did put it back to stock, as I said, about a week ago, and I played with it and sat with it. I know what it does now and how it sounds. The 1K cathode resistor is on there right now. I'm going to keep that on there. Where I'm going to reduce the gain now, which I didn't when I was doing this before, is this plate load resistor. A more sort of typical plate load resistor value is 100K. I want this overdrive to break up, but to break up in a certain way. I also want to reduce the gain, so I'm going to start here. And actually, you would think a change from 220K down to 100K would have your gain. You'll see when we do this that that's not actually true. It doesn't change the gain drastically. I'm going to put metal film resistors in there. They have less hiss and less noise. Yes, it's true the carbon comp resistors have a certain kind of a mojo, a certain kind of a tone. That is affected more from the stages before where the overdrive is here. I want to have the overdrive not be quite as hissy, so I'm going to put metal film resistors in there. May or may not then change this 1K here. I might actually go with a 1.5K. I'm thinking a lot more Marshall-y. Those are pretty typical Marshall values. You see this 2 microfarad bypass capacitor. Basically, that would increase the gain from pretty much the low mids for sure, all the way up through the upper frequencies. I'm going to put a 0.68 microfarad capacitor in there, again a Marshall-y value, so it will accent a lot more of the mid to upper mid range and higher frequencies. What I'm talking about changing, here is that plate load resistor. Then I'm going to change to a 100K metal film. Here is the 1K cathode resistor, and here's that 2 microfarad. That's an electrolytic. I'm going to put a 0.68 microfarad tantalum capacitor in there. I've got the Fostex TT15 plugged in. It's not turned on, so I'm going to turn that on. And I'm going to turn my master volume down. Master volume setting isn't going to have any effect on what we're measuring here. That's well after what we're measuring. The overdrive is turned off right now. I've got a 1 kilohertz 85 millivolt signal going in the front end from the Fostex TT15. There you can see a pretty nice clean sine wave going in. You can see the peak to peak level is 85 millivolts. So a nice clean sine wave going in there. When I turn on channel B, that will be at the input to V2A, and the overdrive is turned off right now. So this is just the amplification after the first gain stage, and because we're using the link input, it's the input after those mixing resistors, so it's both V1A and V1B combined. We still get a fairly nice sine wave there. Our peak to peak voltage level on there now has gone up to roughly about 0.7 volts peak to peak, or 700 millivolts, so somewhere around a amplification factor of 7 to 8 times. So now if I take the overdrive in, you will see that this sine wave will get quite a bit bigger. So it went off scale, so we'll bring this back down where we can see it. And our peak to peak level has gone now up to 2.5, 2.6 volts peak to peak. So with the overdrive disengaged, we've got about a 0.7 volt peak to peak. With it engaged, we're getting up to about 2.6. We're getting about 4 times more level, more gain being pushed through there now. So being that this is set the way that I like it, that level of gain is a 4 times increase over the bypassed or no overdrive signal. Now, of course, when I play the guitar into it, there's a lot more signal going in there in the first place. It's already breaking up. We're doing this with a clean signal just to see the degree to which we are increasing how much we're pushing through. If I change that plate load resistor on the overdrive circuit, it should not change anything when we're measuring this and the overdrive is not engaged. It should only change our signals when we engage the overdrive. So by putting that 100K plate load resistor in place of the 220K, what I would expect to see is a lower amplitude output from the overdrive. So we're at 2.5 volts peak to peak here. We may go down to 2 volts peak to peak, maybe 1.5. I don't know yet. We'll find out when we change it. And then what I can do, because I know that this 2.5 volt peak to peak going into V2A is the kind of overdrive sound that I want, I can then take the overdrive and control, and I can turn it up. Right now it's on about 10 o'clock, 10:30. I will turn that back up so I get back to a 2.6, 2.7 volt peak to peak, and we'll see where that is on the overdrive here. And we'll also give that a listen. Okay, well, I've put the 100K plate load resistor on the overdrive circuit. Let's get a look at what things are looking like with that now. Oh, by the way, I forgot when we did the when I was doing the measurements with the 220K still in there, I forgot to measure the DC plate voltage. So the plate voltage with the 220K in there was plus 95 was 99 volts. With the 100K plate load resistor in there, that has now risen to 140 volts. So pretty significant increase in the voltage on the plate. Let's see what the AC signal is looking like. So we got a nice clean AC signal going in there. It's at about 0.086, 0.087 volts peak to peak, or 86, 87 millivolts peak to peak. Okay, so we're still at 0.834 volts on the input to V2A without the overdrive in circuit. We bring the overdrive in and let's see where we're at. 2.1, 2.09 volts peak to peak. So we did get a reduction in the gain. I'm going to bring that back up to that 2.7 volts peak to peak, just so that when I do the playing test, we're comparing apples to apples. So I can increase the overdrive level a bit here. Now we'll take that up to that 2.7. We will give a listen and see what this is sounding like now. I brought the overdrive up a bit from where it was before, so that with this 100K plate load resistor in here, we've got roughly the same level of gain going into V2A with the overdrive engaged. Here is the sound with the overdrive out. Nothing should have changed in terms of this tone. The overdrive, when it's out, is completely out of the circuit. So here it is anyway. So going from memory, it sounds pretty much like it did before. Here's the overdrive engaged. Nice, I like that. It sounds a little less compressed, a little more open, which is what I would expect with a lower plate load resistor in there. Liking the tone of that. The overdrive itself, in terms of on the knob, is at about 1130-ish, so I got about a notch more out of it, but I'm liking the tone a little bit better. Let's see if it still cleans up. Take that down to about 4. Yep, cleans up. Take that to 7, play lightly. Yep, it's so far that's a success. I like that. Let's look at how high can I take this overdrive before it starts to get spongy. So there we got it about 1 o'clock. You can just hear it starting to get constricted, just starting to compress a bit there. It sounds brighter to me too now. It doesn't sound as spongy in the bottom end. So I've got this at about 1 o'clock. So let's see what happens. Do we get, yeah, we get some self-oscillation if I get up past 9 o'clock. So it's at 9 o'clock right now. I've got the volume on the guitar down. Let's bring it up, see if we get any, no, we're not getting any feedback. Let's see how this sounds. So pretty woolly there, but overall it's a big improvement in my opinion. It's late Friday night right now. This is going to take probably a couple of days for me to go through. I want to sit with things at the various stages before I go too far changing things again. Just going to go over a couple of things, what my thoughts are with this change right now. So as I said, this is an improvement. The tone is tighter. It doesn't sound quite as compressed, so it's not as mushy. I can get a lot more range out of the overdrive control. So I think I'm on the right track with this. Like I say, I'm going to play with this next segment of this video. I will be back letting you know what I thought and letting you know whether I'm buttoning this up permanently or whether we're going to make some more changes. Well, it's a couple days later now, and I've been able to do a little bit more playing and tweaking with this, and I've got the overdrive where it works for me, where I like it. As I said, there was not any problem with this amp stock. It just more gain than I would use, and I would rather have more a finer control of my overdrive range with that overdrive pot. Let me kind of detail what I did. The last thing I did was I put in that 100K plate load resistor here. I've left that in, and I did like the crunch, the overdrive tone that I was getting with that. I did compare it on my my two samples, and I didn't find that the tone changed greatly, and I just liked, I found that the overdrive was a little more open. I still had it where I had to keep the overdrive control pretty far below noon. There's nothing wrong with that. It just left a whole lot of range on that pot that I wasn't using for anything. The plate load and cathode resistors were at a good spot. I was getting a kind of crunch that I liked, but what I wanted to do was increase how much control I had over that lower third. Something I'd been kind of thinking about all along. I was looking at some schematics of some other well-known high gain amps. I was looking at one in particular that had very high interstage attenuation. So what do I mean by interstage attenuation? To go back to our overdrive, the overdrive pot, if you look at it, when it's full up, your signal comes straight out, goes basically straight to the grid of V2A when you have the overdrive switched in. As you turn the overdrive control down though, what you're doing is you're changing the circuit. You're leaving then some of the resistor here up above the wiper and some of it below. So let's say you set this so that half the resistance of the pot was above the wiper and half the resistance was below. So you had a 500K resistance here before it goes to the grid, and then a 500K resistance to ground. What that does is it attenuates or pads the signal. So you might have for argument, let's say a 2-volt peak-to-peak signal coming here at the top of the pot, and so when your overdrive pot was turned up all the way, you'd have a 2-volt peak-to-peak signal going into this grid. When you turn this to that point where you've got half the resistance above and half the resistance below, you're taking the level of that signal down by 50%. So now, instead of having a 2 volt peak-to-peak signal going to this grid, you have a 1 volt peak-to-peak signal going to the grid. That's attenuation. That's an interstage attenuator. This 500K above here is attenuating the signal going on to the next stage. Why would we want to do that? It's very common in high gain amps. Even Marshalls, you'll see stages where there's a 470K and a 470K. So they're taking that output from a previous stage and then knocking it down before it goes on to the next stage. If you have too much signal going into the next grid, it's going to get really heavily compressed. It's going to get a really kind of constrained sound. If you go enough, if you push enough signal into that, you get into what's called blocking distortion, which is really, really spitty. It sounds, the closest thing I could compare it to would be to like a really extreme fuzz setting, and it's not very nice or usable, and that's called blocking distortion. So you can, you would put an attenuator in there if you feel you're sending too much signal into the next stage. Beyond the point where that tube is taking so much signal that it cuts off. In other words, the signal goes as negative as it can and there's no change by forcing more into it, or it saturates at the top where it's just, again, it's putting out as much signal as it can, and no matter how much more you push into there, it can't push any more signal through. It's not really usable drive. So you would knock that down. It's kind of similar to gain staging with pedals. It actually is gain staging, where you take one pedal. You might have an amp that's clean or just on the edge of breakup, and you put one pedal in and you tweak it just a little bit so it just kind of sparkles and gets a little bit of crunch. And then you put another pedal after that that just brings it up even a little bit more, and you kind of gradually build your stages. You build your gain, you gain stage to build to a signal that distorts in a way that you like. There's more harmonic content when you do that. It's more controllable. A number of benefits to doing that. So you're still keeping the effect of however much overdrive or crunch you've introduced in the stage before, but then before you go on to the next grid where you might want to push that farther, you're limiting how big the wave is going in there so that you can actually do more with that next stage. That's a really simple way of looking at it. As I said, I was looking at some very well-known high gain amps, and I was noticing that in some cases they were doing some really major interstage attenuation. So you can do that by adding another resistor in here. So if you look at the overdrive pot, if that were turned up full, I could, for example, put a 1 meg resistor here and then take my output from the top of the overdrive control going to the grid, and it will have halved the amplitude of my signal. So again, using that 2 volt peak to peak signal, if I put a 1 meg resistor in here and take my signal from here, I've got a 1 volt peak to peak signal here, and then my overdrive control is working on that 1 volt peak to peak signal. So I can get more control over the range that I like by doing that. And this is a ratio, so you know, you got a 1-to-1, you're going to reduce your signal by 50%. If you had, for example, a 2 meg resistor up here, and this as the 1 meg, when this volume is full up, you would have a signal that is a third the amplitude of the signal coming out the plate up here. One that sticks to mind, or comes to mind, is there was a 3 meg resistor, 3.3 meg resistor at the top, and then there was a 390K resistor at the bottom. So they were taking like they were taking 90% of that signal and knocking it down, so the peak signal was 10% of what it was coming out the plate before. And I had been thinking about this, some interstage attenuation, and I thought, well, that might do it for me. I redid my 1 kilohertz sine wave test. That 85 millivolts that I was using, I thought was a little bit kind of low, and it was good for, you know, just the initial sort of testing that I was doing, but I wanted to make this a little more real world. And that Fostex TT15 signal generator that I have, it has three attenuation levels: 0 dB, -10, and -30. So on -30 was where I was getting the 85 millivolt peak-to-peak signal. I just took that up to the -10, and then that gave me about an 850, 860 millivolt peak-to-peak signal. That's a 430 millivolt peak signal, or a 304 millivolt RMS signal. So basically that's about the level of a very high output humbucker. I injected a stronger signal into the front of the amp, and then I turned the bright volume right off. And I adjusted the normal volume so that with the overdrive out, I got my maximum peak-to-peak clean signal going into V2A. So I knew right where on the edge of clipping what would be my maximum signal swing. And by doing that, I got a 1.28 volt peak-to-peak going into V2A. So I had increased that signal, not to a great degree, but I was putting a healthier signal into V2A. Then what I did was I switched in the overdrive, and I turned it up until I could get my maximum signal swing before I started getting clipping. That gave me a 3.6 volt peak-to-peak going into V2A. So a pretty significant increase over that 860 millivolt peak-to-peak that I was putting in the front of the amp. So basically about 4 times, maybe a little more than 4 times, and that was before it started clipping. So then I started playing around with interstage attenuation. So there was none on there as the circuit is designed. So here after C4, I put in a 1 meg resistor. I'll show you the real world example of that when we get to what I settled on. I injected my signals again, and I adjusted the overdrive control to where I still had that 3.6 volt peak-to-peak going into V2A with the overdrive circuit engaged. And yes, I was able to take that overdrive control up farther because I was attenuating and I still had that clean signal going in. So then what I did was I took the signal generator off, plugged the guitar in, played around with it, set it to my favorite gain settings, and I was able to get the overdrive level up a little under noon, let's call it 11 a.m., and that gave me the kind of crunch that I wanted. I got a little more range out of my overdrive control. I thought, okay, well, let's try a 2.2 meg in there. Basically, the way that I do these things is if I think something will be a benefit, I will double a value. So starting off, I knew that I wanted to knock that signal down, and I figured a 50% knockdown of that signal would be a good starting place. So that's how I settled on a 1 meg. And then from there, I just to hear any appreciable difference or see any appreciable difference, I just doubled it. So I put a 2.2 meg to see what that did. I turned the bright volume off. I set my normal volume to where I had that clean 1.28 volt peak to peak coming to V2A after the initial gain stage without the overdrive in. Switched the overdrive in, and yes, I was able to turn the overdrive even farther to get that 3.6 volt clean peak-to-peak signal going into V2A with the overdrive. I set my normal and bright volume back to about 2 o'clock, where I get my best crunch on the clean sound or on the non-overdrive sound, and I was able to take the overdrive up even farther to get back to the same kind of overdrive level that I had with the 1 meg resistor in there. So I was able to get the overdrive control up to about 2 o'clock. So that was really close. I spent a lot of time playing around with it on that. Did some testing, turned the normal volume all the way up, the bright volume all the way up, the overdrive all the way up. It was still way too much gain. I never run everything full out, but I just wanted to see how far I could go. I still felt like I could get a little more fine control of the overdrive range that I like with the overdrive control, so I decided to go all the way to a 4.7 meg. I put a 4.7 meg resistor in here, so basically I'm knocking that signal down by about 80%. So what's going on to the next grid when the overdrive volume is full up is only 20% of the signal swing that comes right off the plate. I did the same thing, turned my bright volume off, and then I brought in the overdrive and turned that up to where I could get that 3.6 clean signal, peak to peak. And that got my overdrive up to about almost full. On the dial, it would have been at about 4:30, basically 5 o'clock would be the maximum, and I was just a little bit under that, maybe between 4 and 5 o'clock. So that was good. I had a lot more range. And then I set my controls back, my normal volume, bright volume, to 2 o'clock, and plugged the guitar in and set the overdrive to where it sounded approximately the same as it had previously. And I had the overdrive up at about 3:30, so fairly high up. You know, I had a couple of notches to go before it went full, and that did it for me. When I turned the overdrive full up, I got a lot of saturation, a lot of sustain. It was just on the edge of compressing, and when I brought the normal and bright volume up full as well, it compressed more than I would want, but it was still kind of in a sort of usable range. Again, I think I used the example of Cinnamon Girl by Neil Young. It had that sort of that really kind of heavily compressed, tube compressed overdrive. So I thought that was a pretty good place to stop, so that's where I've stopped. So my overdrive now has a 4.7 meg resistor attenuating the signal coming out. When you do that, that resistor can also darken the tone of your amp, your overdrive. It's one of the good things that happens doing that in a high gain amp. You kind of need to darken them. You don't want to boost the bottom end because your bottom end will get really flubby or farty. The high end, you can have a lot of problems with self-oscillation, squealing. It can be very buzzy sounding. So you kind of want to take some of that top end off, and putting that resistor in there darkens it up and can deal with those fizzy buzzy issues. If you do something like that and you find that the distortion is just not as bright as you like, doesn't have as much bite to it, doesn't sound the way you want, you can bypass around that attenuating resistor with a 250 picofarad, a small capacitor, and let some of that high end bypass around the resistor and get some of your high end back in. In my case, I like the sound of it right now the way it is. Again, from my previous experience, I'll play with this for a while, and if I do find it's too dark, I'll probably put a capacitor around that resistor. But for now, I've got it where I like it, and I'll show you some samples soon. But what I want to do is show you a little bit of the testing and how I did things. Here's the probe for my oscilloscope that's measuring my input signal, and I'm measuring it on the link input so that I can know what level's going into both the normal volume and bright volume. When I play my guitar, I do use the normal and bright volume, so I wanted to be able to inject my sine wave there and see what the normal and bright volume were doing when it gets to V2A, as well as when I plug my guitar in. So this is the probe going to my oscilloscope, just monitoring the input signal coming right in before anything in the amp. And then here you can see right now I've unplugged the probe, but I've got the clip from my probe, and that's clipped onto the input of V2A, which is where we're concerned about our signal levels. So as I said, I like the sound of this amp. I didn't want to do anything to change the sound of this amp when the overdrive's not engaged. Right from the beginning, before I changed everything, and as I've gone along and made a change, I've done recording samples to, number one, see how the overdrive has changed, but also when I have the overdrive switched out, to be sure that my sound has not changed on my non-overdrive tones, and it didn't. We wouldn't expect it to. Everything we are changing is switched out of the circuit when that switch is switched to normal operation. And here is where I put that attenuating resistor in. Here's the coupling cap from the plate of V2B, or the overdrive. So this just blocks the DC from the plate from going on to the rest of the the circuit. You can change the value of this capacitor as well. You can use a bigger one to let more bottom end through, or smaller one to let less bottom end through. There are many places you can change the tone of an amp, and depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And one of the places you could increase or reduce your bottom end would be by changing the value of this capacitor. But its main purpose is to block the DC from the plate of the previous stage getting to the next stage. What I did was, obviously there's no turret here, but I was able to cut the lead on this coupling cap and then put the resistor in the space in there, twist this together and solder it. So here's that 4.7 meg resistor, and then this is the connection off to the overdrive pot. Our signal level here will be full level, 100%. Our signal level here will be 20% of this signal level. We'll look at that on the oscilloscope. So that's what I've done in here. So let's look at some things that the oscilloscope are showing us. So again, I have a live amp here. I'm just gonna, while I connect the probe, I just want to take that amp not live. We don't want any surprises. And then I'm going to show you how I did this. Okay, so you can see on the oscilloscope here, I've got that input signal. It's just about 0.9 volts peak to peak. Right now I have the normal and bright volume turned off and the overdrive disengaged. So I will bring up that normal volume. You can see that the signal's coming up. We're getting up to about 0.8 or about 1.5 volts peak to peak. You'd look at that and say that that's a sine wave, but it's not. There's some soft clipping going on there. If you look at this this wave here, you can see the bottom is still doing a pretty tight corner, pretty tight hairpin, I would call that. But up here you can see that the signal is skewing a little bit to the left, and the corner is not quite as tight as it is down here. That's soft clipping. This is generally what you'll see with a tube, is it will clip. It won't clip on both sides. If we turn that farther, you'll see that the bottom remains relatively clean. The top will continue to fall apart. We're getting close to saturation here. The bottom's still hanging together very well, but the top is almost clipped straight off. And that would be some pretty crispy distortion. So we'll take this back. So my clean signal before overdrive was at about 1.28 volts peak to peak. So I'm just going to set that back there. You can see that that top is starting to round off a little bit better. And there, we're at about 1.28 there. And you can see that we've got a pretty nice sine wave still going on here. Then I brought the overdrive in. And you'll see it go flat here because I've got the overdrive level turned off all the way right now. A little bit of ripple there, or a bleed through there, but that doesn't matter. And then I started bringing the overdrive signal up. And you'll see we can go a lot farther before we start clipping. In the previous stage, we went to where we were just clipping in that triode. We were clipping there. The tube was doing as much as it could, not because we couldn't put more into the front end here. You can see with the overdrive, I've still got a pretty nice sine wave, and I've got the overdrive at about 2 o'clock. We've got a 3.3 volt signal there, starting to skew there a bit, and I've got the overdrive at about 1 o'clock, 1:30. As I go farther, you'll see that that top starts to distort more and more. This is still pretty soft clipping. It's starting to get aggressive. Again, you see the bottom of our waveform is still pretty clean. It's just skewing off at the top. And we've got a 7.9 and 8 volt peak to peak signal here. We take that back to where it's still clean. That was at about 3.6 volts, so right about there. And you see we still got a pretty good sine wave. It's a little bit crooked here. That was the way that I looked at where I was going to be able to set the overdrive control and how much I was affecting that range. Again, that's what I was looking for. I know I could go a lot farther and get a lot more gain out of this stage, but it's just pushing too much into V2A, and it not holding together for me. So I wanted to get that range so that I could get the control, the overdrive control up higher, and that way I would have a finer control of the crunch that I actually use. So that's with the normal volume is at about 10 o'clock, and the overdrive volume is at about 1:30, and I'm still getting a relatively clean signal through the amp. But that's not how I'm using it. I'm overdriving. So before I do that, let me show you. I'll turn the amp off, and I'll take this probe off of V2A, and we'll just look at the signal coming off that at the end of the coupling cap before that 4.7 meg resistor, and then we'll look at the other end of the coupling cap. So there is no high DC here, so there's no high voltage there right now, but you still want to be careful anytime you're working on a live amp, because we've only got, what, three quarters of an inch to where there is some high voltage. At any rate, this is the signal level that's coming right off the top. If we look at this, I'll have to change my range here, and this will be a clean sine wave still. And we've got a lot of available level there. We've got 78 volt peak to peak. That's still a clean sine wave coming out of V1B, clean sine wave, and we've got 78 volts peak to peak there. On the other side, we got about 12 and a quarter volts peak to peak on the other side. So we've attenuated that signal by about 80%. I'm not going to do the math on it, but pretty close. We can get a better look at it. We can see that it's still a really clean sine wave. We've just knocked the level down. So that's what went on with my gain experiments and where I settled on this. So let's see what it sounds like. All right, so now what I've got is my favorite non-overdrive mid-gain setting on the Triwatt, the setting that sells me on this amp. Just where I love where this amp lives, right here. So throughout this whole video, I have not changed the settings of the tone controls at all. They're still the way they were at the top of the video. I have not changed where the normal and bright volume are generally, because as I said, I was playing around with them to get my sine wave signals there, but I know where they were set. I know that I had the bright volume pointing at the bottom corner of the C in custom. So I set that there, and I know that the normal volume was set exactly the same. So I just set those two parallel. So that's for my master volume is full up. I'm not so much about preamp distortion alone. I like to overdrive the power section. That's one of the reasons I really like using the two notes Captor 8 and Captor X, or even a dummy load and using my Cab M. I have all three of those, and it's so that I can crank my masters on my amp. My general way of getting a tone I like is to have the master volume cranked and then set the preamps where I get a nice mid-gain distortion. And this amp has a built-in overdrive. Most of my other ones don't. I use pedals for everything else. We'll get into my effects rig another time. But that's my general process. This is all set the same, with the exception that the overdrive will now be set to a different range to get the same sort of gain I was getting before. And I'm doing that by ear. But anyway, here is with the overdrive disengaged, and I'll insert clips from my other previous tests of this same non-overdrive setting, and you should see that they don't change, or not much anyway. The volumes could be slightly in different places, but here's the non-overdrive sound, and it's still the same. I'm just playing to give you the idea of the crunch. I'm not really trying to, this isn't a playing video, if you get what I mean. So there, that's my basic mid-gain crunch. That's kind of where I would set this amp, and then do everything else with my effects rig. So, but let's bring in the overdrive. So I'll bring it in, and it's all the way off, so nothing, right? As I bring this up, there you can really hear it start to kind of click over right there. That's at about 1 o'clock. So this is what I was looking for, was to be able to get from here, which is a little bit more gain, a little bit more overdrive. Here's with the overdrive out. And then I bring that in, and we get just a little bit smoother. And then I can take this up, you know, there's at about 2 o'clock. So that's really about as far as I will use this. You can hear it starting to compress. You can hear that the lower, especially like a low E, you can kind of hear it kind of squash. It's compressing just a little bit. I can go all the way full up on that overdrive, and you'll really hear it compress. You can hear a couple of things that I hear when I do you can hear how that has fallen apart a little bit, is the way I describe it. It's a lot looser. If I take the overdrive back to kind of where I really like it, those chunk 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 are pretty tight. They're loosening up a bit. If I take the overdrive right up and do the same thing, it's softer. It's not as punchy. Here is where the overdrive sounds about like it did way back at the beginning of this video with my first test, where I had the overdrive and I said I had dialed it to where I like it. And that was with the overdrive set at about 9:30 or 10 o'clock. Now I've got the overdrive set at about just about 2 o'clock. And that sounds like about the same amount of overdrive. So I'm really happy with that, because I've got a lot more range with this control. If I do turn the overdrive full up, it's still a usable overdrive, definitely for solos. It hangs together quite well. And probably mostly what I'll use this overdrive for is to kick in on solos. Crunch rhythm sound is going to be without the overdrive. That's without overdrive. This is with overdrive. You know, if I crank that right up for soloing, over the next week or two, I'm going to play around with it like this now, and I'm sure now that I'm done with this. And so when I've had a little time to play with this, get more used to it, have my my pedal rig slotted in here as well, I will do another video of me playing a more high gain tune, and do that maybe using only overdrive from the Triwatt. Like I say, I have some pedals that I generally use and will keep using for my gain tones, but to demonstrate the Triwatt, I'll see what we can do with just the Triwatt for all the crunch tones. Probably use the Golden Horse too. Like I say, that's my always on pedal. It's kind of part of my tone. So as always, thanks for watching. Probably another pretty long video here. I'll know when I get it edited. And I appreciate you guys sticking through this. I know it can get a little bit like watching paint dry sometimes. Like and subscribe. Check out my band One Soul Thrust. The links are below as always. Thanks for watching. I'm liking this Triwatt.